Hi, my name is Steve Podrachik for Seattle Avionics. I'm here to tell you about what's new in FlyQ EFB version 4.5. This is what we call the weather update, and it'll be pretty evident why in a second. What we tried to do here was a couple of things. We want to dramatically improve the ability for you to do pre-flight planning, predict where weather is going to be in the future at different altitudes and so on. To dramatically improve the safety while you're in flight, typically using an ADS-B receiver to again be aware of the weather that's around you and is expected to happen soon. To do this, we're taking advantage of all of the available weather sources, whether it's from an ADS-B system or from the internet. And we want to make sure that the system works appropriately, whether you're doing pre-flight planning or whether you're in the cockpit. You'll see what I mean during the demo in a minute. I will show you what it's like to do pre-flight planning and then navigate in flight, and you can see the differences. Features. So what do we do here to make the product better? Well, there used to be 7 weather layers in the product. Now there are 16. And that's pretty evident when you take a look at that pop-up. In that pop-up there, you see that it used to be 2 columns wide. Now it's 3 columns. And the entire middle column is nothing but weather. That means that you get all the new ADS-B weather products. For example, you get things like cloud tops, you get turbulence, icing, lightning, pyreps. All of that now comes from the ADS-B system. That's in addition to, of course, things like radar and winds aloft and METARs. It also means that you have a lot of new internet products. In fact, generally speaking, any weather product that's available on the internet is also available on ADS-B and vice versa. So it doesn't matter too much if you're playing at your desk using an internet-based weather system or if you're in the flying a plane using ADS-B. There are a couple of exceptions, and when we get through with the demo, I'll point those out to you. We also added a new timeline at the bottom of the screen. The timeline is very important because it moves both backwards into the past and forwards into the future. So for example, with radar, you can back it up by an hour or two and see what the weather used to be like. And because we added exclusively predictive radar, the predictive radar system lets you move the weather 1 hour into the future and see what the radar is predicted to look like. Of course, this also works with things like winds aloft, with METARs and TAFs, and so on. We have a new altitude slider. A lot of the weather products that we have, again, things like winds aloft or turbulence and icing, things like that, those are really sensitive to whatever altitude you're looking at. So we have a new altitude slider that lets you very clearly see, just by flicking the screen, what kind of weather is expected at different altitudes. By the way, the altitude slider adapts to different aircraft. So if you fly higher than flight level 240, you can make that altitude slider go higher. Also, again, you notice that there's an awful lot of weather products, 16 of them. So you can imagine that the colors and the symbology make it a little bit confusing. Therefore, in that pop-up, again on the right-hand side at the very bottom, is something that says Legend. If you tap on the word Legend there, you get this. This tells you what all the different colors mean for radar and for satellite, what the symbols and the colors mean for METARs and TAFs, lightning, surface winds, and so on. All the different cloud systems, icing, turbulence, airmets, sigmets, pyreps, surface analysis. It's all right there, easy to get to on the screen. By the way, little tip, if you're looking at this in the product on your iPhone, this may be too small to read, so just pinch and zoom to make it a little bit bigger. Very easy. Also, the timeline in the altitude slider, and you'll see this a lot during the demo, the altitude slider and the timeline behave differently whether you're flying the aircraft or whether you're at your desk. It'll automatically adapt to keep the screen decluttered if you're flying and to give you lots of options if you're doing pre-flight planning. Again, you'll see this during the product demo, which is a great segue. Let's do the product demo. So let's take a look at how new FlyQ EFB 4.5 works in terms of weather. One thing to understand, of course, is that the product will behave very differently whether you're, like I am right now, sitting at your desk doing pre-flight planning versus you're actually in the plane and flying. Fundamentally has a lot to do with how much screen clutter there is on your display. For example, when you're planning a flight at your desk, it's probably okay to see a timeline and an altitude slider and such. But when you're navigating in the plane, you probably want to keep that to a minimum unless you really do want to play with different altitudes or the timeline. But most of the time you want to keep it clean. So a good way to demonstrate this is to show you what it's like to plan a flight and see how the weather system works there. Then we'll simulate flying the flight. After that, we'll take a look at how all the different weather layers work, because there are a lot of new ones here. All right, so let's plan the flight. I happen to know that the weather in the Midwest isn't very good right now, so I'm going to plan a flight from Kansas City, which happens to be MCI, I used to live there, to NSE. So I type that into the search box at the top of the app, hit the blue search button on the keyboard. The system will create a flight plan now, wind optimize and so on for me. All right, so there's the flight plan on the screen. What I want to do right now is to take a look at weather. And one of the things we found when working with this version of the product is that an aviation map, whether it's a sectional like this one, or even an IFR low or high chart, can be a little bit cluttered when you turn on weather layers. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to tap the stack of paper icon and switch it to the road layer, which is very, very clean and very simple. I'm going to turn on my radar. So I can clearly see that we probably shouldn't be taking this flight, right? It's going right through the heart of radar. But let's ignore that for a moment. I'm going to turn on the METAR layer and the winds aloft layer. By the way, you probably already noticed that there's a lot more weather layers in the previous version of the product. Previously, there were something like 7 weather layers. Now there's 16. So I tap off the screen. I'll zoom in a little bit. And let's actually get rid of the radar layer. We don't really need that anymore. What I want to focus on now is what it's going to be like as if we were actually planning the flight. So if you take a look down the bottom of the screen at the timeline, most of the timeline line itself is white, except for a magenta portion. That magenta portion is the same color that you see in the flight plan line. Therefore, if we back up the map a little bit, what it's trying to tell you is that the flight is planned from about 7:30 p.m. tonight till about 3 o'clock in the morning on the timeline. The magenta line on the map is the same as the magenta line on the timeline. So here's the fun part to this. So let's zoom into the beginning of the flight. When we're looking right now at current time, you see a lot of green dots on the screen in the Kansas City area at the top. The reason why you see so many green dots is because the weather condition at about 6:45, which is the time right now in real life, in Kansas City is pretty good. There's a lot of green dots. Green means VFR conditions. You only see one red dot on the screen and a couple of yellows towards the bottom, but all in all, it looks pretty good. But let's see how the weather will change during the flight. So the first thing I'm going to do is to move the timeline to someplace a little bit after the beginning of the flight, maybe about 9 o'clock. Move it to here. Now, did you notice one thing first, is that there used to be a lot of dots in the Kansas City area, around Topeka, Kansas City, and so on. Now there are not that many. Let me back it up again and show that to you. So if we move it back to here, so this is more like current time, you see a lot of green dots. Move it to 9 p.m., you don't see a lot of dots at all. Why is that? That's not a bug. What it means is that the METAR and TAF layer in FlyQ EFB is just that. It's METAR or TAF. So, since METAR only lasts for an hour, when I move the timeline back to about current time, so let's say 6:45, I'm picking up all of those METARs which are reporting weather. Now, METARs tend to be automated systems, so there are a lot more airports that have METARs than have TAFs. When I move it again to about 9 o'clock, I see that there's simply a lot fewer reporting stations. The other thing you probably noticed is that the colors changed. Again, let's just go back here a little bit. So now when we take a look around the current time, around the Springfield, Joplin area, there are a lot of green dots, and nothing, in fact, really other than green. Bring it, though, to 9 p.m., and now all of a sudden you see red dots, which are IFR conditions around Joplin. And further south, you see a lot of yellow, which are marginal VFR conditions, and red dots. Clearly the weather is changing during the flight. You also, again, I just move it again one more time, notice that the winds aloft arrows have changed considerably too. So for example, in the Kansas City area at about the current time, you have a big green arrow going directly to the, well, almost directly to the west at 17 knots. First thing you may want to know is at what altitude that is. Well, there's an altitude slider on the right-hand side of the screen. So let's say that we're flying at about 8,000 feet, 9,000 feet. Set it to that. And it looks like in the Kansas City area at about 6 o'clock, at about 6:30 rather, and 9,000 feet, there's a 7-knot wind hitting more or less directly north. And around Springfield, Missouri, in the middle of the screen, you have, at that same 9,000 feet, you have a 7-knot wind hitting to the west. Let's see how the wind changes over time as well. So again, we'll move it to about 9 o'clock. And indeed, the winds in the Springfield area have changed considerably. You now have a 26-knot wind. And in fact, if you take a look back at Kansas City, the winds are no longer heading to the north, but they're actually heading to the south. Okay, let's just back that up so you can see that. So the winds have gotten in the Springfield area, they've gone from about 7 knots to 26 knots, quite a difference. So this is an example of why we call this four-dimensional weather. By using the altitude slider to pick an altitude, like I'll pick a different altitude, and you see the winds are different. And by using the timeline, you can get a good sense of what the weather is going to be like, not just right now, but actually where you're going to be at a certain time. Get a better sense of this too. Let's just back this up a little bit and continue moving along. Let's see what it's like at our destination. Our destination, let's move it to maybe 9 o'clock at night. So our destination is KNSE. If I take a look at our current position, so it's a pretty long flight, right? But that's at about 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, it looks like there's a green dot all in that area around Pensacola, Mobile, KNSE. All of those are green. Let's move the timeline though up a little bit. Well, at 10 o'clock, it's about the same. At 11 o'clock, notice that KNSE is suddenly red. Let's take a look. I'll just single tap over there, and it tells me that indeed the METAR currently from there is saying VFR. But if I scroll up a little bit, I see that, at 11 o'clock, between 11 o'clock and 5 a.m., we have low IFR conditions with visibility very, very small, less than 2 miles. So clearly, I think you're going to have the case where you really wouldn't want to do this flight. But in the example that you did want to do the flight, you're going to clearly see that by the time, I'll move the timeline a little here, as you get very close to landing, the weather conditions in the Pensacola and Mobile area are no longer green, they're now marginal VFR, and at KNSE, it's low IFR. In other words, really, really not a good time to do this flight. So that's how you can plan a flight using FlyQ EFB and the new weather system. It really helps you plan a flight as the safest and most efficient way to get there. But that's what it looks like while you're planning the flight. I mentioned before that the system behaves differently and looks differently if you're actually in the middle of the flight. So let's do that. Obviously, I can't jump in the plane right now and take this flight in real life. What I can do, though, is I can turn on the simulator that's built into FlyQ EFB. So if I tap on the upper part of the app, on the upper right side where it says GPS, WX, and so on, tap anywhere on those buttons, I have a built-in GPS simulator. I'm going to turn that on right now. Just flip on the simulator. And there we go. Tap off. And now we are flying along from Kansas City Airport. Weather conditions are green, and so on. Notice though what just happened. All of a sudden the timeline disappeared and the altitude slider disappeared. Why is that? Well, that's what I was talking about before, that as a practical matter when you're flying the airplane, you probably don't want to have all that stuff on the screen. That is doubly true if you're using some kind of a split screen configuration like this. You have a relatively small screen that you're looking at. So clearly what we're trying to do here is while you're flying the plane, we want to reduce the clutter. I'm going to go back to single screen now. Okay, but at that same time, you may wonder as you're flying though, especially if you're hooked up to an ADS-B receiver and you're getting live weather feeds as you make this flight, you might wonder what the flight's going to be like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours ahead of where you are. So let's try that. First, I'm just going to move the simulator to maybe about a little bit ways on the flight. So right now we're heading towards Springfield, and you may wonder, well, that's great. Notice that what altitude we're flying at. In addition to, you can turn the gauge on here, so you can see your gauges on the top, and on the upper left-hand side it says altitude 5,500. But even if you didn't have that visible, in the upper right corner where the altitude slider would normally be, you have a button in blue that says WX Alt 5K. So that's telling you that the altitude that's being used to display the weather, which is at the moment winds aloft, is coming from 5,000 feet. Let's say that you want to just see what the winds are going to be like at a different altitude. You just tap on WX Alt, and you can say, well, what if I was flying at 10,000 feet? Just move the slider up to 10,000. Boom, weather's a little different. Let's say that you were thinking about flying up to maybe 16,000. Winds are considerably different. Or maybe you're thinking about just flying in maybe 4,000 feet. Okay, so you can quickly see while you're flying. But here's the fun part. Let's say that I move this to 16,000 feet. Okay, the winds are definitely different. And you're looking at this and you're trying to make a decision, should I fly higher or lower? But when it comes right down to it, you're flying the airplane. So look what just happened. The screen snapped all of a sudden from the altitude that I was looking at to the altitude that I'm actually flying at. This is very important because what the system tries to do is to remove screen clutter and to always make sure that if you aren't actively playing with the weather, you see the weather that is observed right now during the flight. Same kind of thing with the timeline. So let's move this display a little bit like that. And let's say that you were curious about what the weather is going to be like in a couple of hours. Well, here you can manually turn the timeline. We made this a little harder than on the weather altitude because we figure people won't do this quite as often. But to turn on the timeline during flight, you tap on the Layers button on the left-hand side of the screen. You then, in the lower right corner of that pop-up, it says Tools. There's Timeline, Altitude, Slider, and Legend. So let's pick Timeline. Now I have my timeline on the screen, and I can move my time slider. I'm going to do something now. Notice that there are actually two dots, two icons for the aircraft on the screen. One is dark blue near Springfield, because that represents where we really are. And then that light blue one near Jonesboro is where we're going to be at the time on the timeline, which is about 8:15, 8:30. So you see a ghost of the plane when you're moving the timeline, like this. That shows you where you're going to be at given times on the timeline. But when you release it, it'll stay on the screen at that location for a few seconds, for I think about 20 seconds. And then the timeline and the ghost airplane will disappear, and you're seeing where you really are at that time. And now the screen is nice and clear. It's easy to see what's happening, and you get the general idea. So this is what it's like more to use it in flight. One other thing I should mention too. On the timeline, I'll turn that on again. If you're really flying this flight, not in simulation mode, the timeline actually begins at whatever your current time period is. That is, instead of seeing this magenta line, which is my pre-flight planning time, my starting time to my ending time, we don't really know when you're flying an airplane for sure when you took off. We don't really care. But we do know what your current speed is. So that magenta line on the screen will always begin at the current time period, and then based on your ground speed, it will continue until you get to your landing. So the line is a little bit different whether you're actually flying a plane or whether you're doing pre-flight planning or even doing simulation. You'll get it when you use it in flight. All right, now let's take a look at some of the other weather products. So we spent a lot of time taking a look at just the METARs and the winds aloft, but there's a lot more in the system. Let's begin by turning off the simulator, and we'll just take a look back at the flight that we're doing. All right, so we have a flight on the screen. Same flight line as we did before, but let's add some additional weather layers. To do that, I just tap that stack of papers icon on the left-hand side, and let's begin with something simple. We'll just begin with radar. So with the radar, when we take a look at radar at approximately our current time, take a look. Looks pretty bad, right? Radar is one of the products that we put a lot of emphasis into in this release of the product. So the current time in real life, it doesn't display this on the screen, I know. If you look into the video, it says it's 9:41 a.m. In real life, it's about a little bit before 7 o'clock p.m. So if I take this timeline, and if I move it backwards a little bit to 5 o'clock, if I move it to about the current time, I see what the weather is like right now. But we also added something pretty darn cool, which is predictive radar. So again, it's about 7 o'clock here. If I move this time slider up to about 7:45, that is now where that's not real radar because that's in the future. This is predictive radar showing us where the weather is predicted to be in about an hour. Now, if we move the timeline further, it disappears because at this point we're just too far out of range. We're not trying to predict anything. But when you have it within an hour of your current time, like say 8 o'clock, then we can show you weather which is predicted. Pretty darn cool. So you can go backwards in time or you can go forwards in time. You also should know that you have the ability to move it to make that timeline a lot easier to do. Basically, when you have a map and you want to make it bigger, you just take two fingers and pinch and zoom. Pretty simple. You can do the same thing on the timeline. For example, if I want to zoom into the area between about 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., I take my fingers and I can do that. Now everything is much bigger, easier to hit. This is particularly handy if you're using an iPhone. It's much easier to do this. Okay, so you can really zoom in. A couple of other little neat things. Let's say that you want to very quickly get back to the current time. Well, if you don't feel like using your finger to try to remember exactly what the current time is, So let's say that you had the timeline selected to about 2 o'clock in the morning for some reason. If you double tap anywhere on the timeline, it's going to do two things. One, it'll snap back to the current time. And if you zoomed in the timeline, as I've done here, it will unzoom it. So let's take a look. Again, double tap anywhere in the timeline. And it goes back. So the current time right now is about 6:45 and so on. So very, very easy to do. Okay. All right, so that's the way that the system works in terms of the timeline, predictive timeline, and so on. We talked a lot about METARs. We talked a lot about winds aloft. Let's go down the list and take a look at some of the other weather products. So right now we're looking at standard radar. Of course, you can also do animated radar. Now, the animated radar, it may be a little bit different than what you expect. The animated radar doesn't animate given the timeline. You can do that yourself. The animated radar is designed to be easier to use, though. It just animates going backwards in time about 30 minutes. So I think it's updated every 5 minutes. So you see what it's going to look like in terms of which direction the radar is moving. You don't have to use a timeline. You don't have to do anything. It just animates on its own. Below the radar, we also have a high-res radar. Now, the high-res radar, you may notice that there's blue colors here, and it's, well, higher resolution. What's the difference? The difference here is that when you use a high-resolution radar, you can't do predictive radar. So if I move my timeline to 8 o'clock, it disappears. On the other hand, if I use a standard radar, we get predictive radar for that same time period. Okay? So that's one of the differences between the standard radar and the high-res radar. One of the other ones, and if you live in Alaska or Hawaii, we apologize for this, the standard radar and the predictive radar do not work in Alaska and Hawaii, but the high-resolution one does. So you're probably going to want to use that some more. Let's take a look, because we did this earlier, let's take a look at our flight here. So if we really were coming in and landing at KNSE, at some point we're going to wonder what the winds are like at the surface. Well, okay, let's take away our radar, and we'll take away our METARs and TAFs. But I just set it to surface winds like this. So now we have this new thing. Notice all those little arrows on the screen there in Pensacola and so on. That means that there's surface winds, and you can tell this because if you use the altitude slider, those don't change. You can set, those are surface winds, not winds aloft. And the arrows are also much smaller than the winds aloft arrows. In fact, just to show you that. So the winds aloft arrows are very, very big, covering a lot of space because they cover a lot of area, while the arrows that are down on the surface are relatively small. They use a coloring though. The color means, let's say that I zoom out a lot. Now I don't have the number in there anymore. What I mean is, if we're close, we see that in Pensacola, there's a 5-knot wind hitting more or less directly north. As you zoom the map out further, you really can't see the numbers anymore, so we just use a color. So you have to know what the color means. Well, one of the things about this product is we added a lot of weather. So let's go back to our pop-up. We have weather layers for all kinds of things, 17 different weather layers. So it's reasonable to think that you may get a little bit confused about what all these things are. Consequently, if you take a look at that lower right-hand corner, the tools area again, the timeline and the altitude slider, the very bottom item on the right-hand side is legend. So let's see what the weather legend looks like. When you tap on the weather legend, you get a pop-up showing you what all these colors and all these symbols mean. So we have a really good sense of what they are. For example, if you take a look in the middle of the screen, you have winds aloft on the left-hand side and then surface winds on the right-hand side. What you find is that they both use the same colors. A green arrow on either winds aloft or surface is light. A yellow or orange is kind of in the middle, and a red one is very strong. But since the realistic definition of a surface wind being strong is different than what a winds aloft strong means, the color keys are different. So for example, on the green side, if you see a green winds aloft, it means the winds are anywhere between 0 and 20 knots. On the other hand, surface winds, green means 0 to 10. And so on. Because the idea is that, if the winds are at, say, 15, 20 knots, you're probably going to be thinking seriously about landing there or not. While if the winds aloft were 15 or 20 knots, probably no big deal. So we use a different color key for the two different things. Let me just close that. You can close it, by the way, either by hitting the done button in the right corner or swiping down, which is what I just did. Okay. Little tip here, by the way. Unfortunately, because we're actually landing at KNSE, we can't see what the surface winds are because the icon for the airport itself is right there. Well, that seems annoying, right? How do I get around that? Hit the layers button and turn off temporarily the flight plan line on the left-hand side. There you go, 7-knot wind. Okay, and just turn it back on again, and you're back in business. Let's talk about some of the more exotic ones. By the way, I should be clear that unless I mention it specifically, every weather layer that you see is available whether you're using an internet-based weather system, like I am right now, or if you're flying a plane connected to an ADS-B receiver. They're almost exactly the same. So let's take a look at another layer. Let's take a look at one of the new ones. I'll turn off winds and surface, and we'll turn on cloud tops. Back up the map a little bit. So the cloud tops layer, and I'm actually going to change this for a second, moving my altitude slider. So the cloud tops, what that's telling you is, depending on what you select on the altitude slider on the right-hand side, that's how high the clouds go up. So when you see it in a color blue or green, it means that, in fact, if you were really at the altitude, like now it's say 2,000 feet, you would be, and you're in the middle of the screen, let's say near Dallas or Jackson, something like that. If you were really flying at 2,000 feet, you would be in the middle of the clouds. But if you take the altitude slider and you move it up, look what happens. The clouds dissipate. So if we go up to, basically, if you're at, say, 11,000 feet, you're above most clouds. If you bring it up to 15,000 feet, you're above just about all the clouds. If there's a cloud that is expected in that area and you're above it, we show it as a light gray, which is why you see most of the area of the screen in light gray. If there's a cloud which is actually at or above your altitude, you see it in a color. So as I move down, you get more color. As you move up, you go above the clouds, and most of the colors begin to disappear. Okay? So that's the cloud top layer. Again, it works with either the internet or it works with ADS-B. One of the few that doesn't, though, is a cloud base layer. So the cloud base layer is kind of a little bit different. What we do with the cloud base layer is cloud bases tend to be in AGL. That is, how far above the ground is the cloud base. You don't really care about the MSL value. Therefore, notice that the altitude slider actually went away because it's not used for this. Rather, we use colors. So the color, green is good, red is bad, yellow is in the middle, right, with FlyQ. So if you see green, that means that the cloud bases don't begin until about 6,500 feet, 6,000 feet, I think. And on the other hand, if you see red, especially a bright red, that means that the clouds begin at less than 2,500 feet. Again, let's pull up the legend and take a look at that. So if you take a look at the cloud base area, you see that, again, if it's less than 2,500 feet, it's red. If it's between, say, 2,500 and 4,500, it's orange. If it's more than 4,500 but less than 6, it's light green. And if it's 6,000 feet or above, you start to see bright green. So again, we use a lot of color coding to give you a good sense of where the cloud layer is. So this one's a color-coded layer, and this one is unfortunately one of the few which is not available when using ADS-B. It's just not in the ADS-B feed. Airmets and segments are not new, but let's go to the turbulence layer, because that is a new layer. Now the turbulence layer is new. That's something which is definitely new in this release of the product, and like many of the other layers, it works perfectly well when using either ADS-B or using internet-based. I'm looking for something right now. There we go. Okay. It also turns on some PIREPs. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the altitude slider. As I move the altitude slider, I'm moving it up right now. Maybe zoom out a little bit here. As I lower now the altitude, you see where the turbulence is changes. Right? So at 5,000 feet, you have turbulence in a lot more of the country than you do at, say, 20,000 feet. Oh, actually, take that back. At 20,000 feet, you see more, but it is in different locations. All right? You can also go backwards in time and see what turbulence looks like if you're using internet-based weather. If you're using ADS-B weather, the timeline doesn't really apply because, by and large, ADS-B weather is just designed for in-flight use to show you what it's like right now. They simply don't have the bandwidth to give you historical and predictive weather in most cases. But what I was showing you before was it also pops up PyReps. So if you turn on the turbulence layer, you begin to see the icons for turbulence automatically. If you want to know more details about that, you can tap on any of them. I'll just tap on one of those. So in this case, you have chop at 36,000 feet, so it's probably not a factor for most of us. But you see the turbulence layer, moderate chop, and so on. You get the full text at the bottom, and you get the simplified stuff in the middle. See if it's any different on this bottom one. Yep. So on the bottom one, it looks like the intensity is more like light to moderate. It's a little bit lower at 28,000 feet. As a practical matter, by the way, the altitude slider does not affect the PyReps. We intentionally wanted to make sure that you saw the PyReps no matter what altitude you're at from a safety perspective. So let's see what it looks like when you take a look at Icing as well. So what I'm doing is I'm going to hit the stack of papers icon. I'm going to leave on turbulence, but also turn on Icing. Icing tends to be in the blue zone, and turbulence tends to be green and reds. So you can actually use them both at the same time. So you can take a look, again, based on the time on the timeline, but also the altitude of what they're going to be like. So for example, right now we're at 6,000 feet, so that's what the icing and the turbulence would look like at 6,000. Move it up to maybe 10. It looks like the icing moved a little bit. Move it up to 15,000. The icing is considerably different. And for that matter, compared to 6,000, so is the turbulence. So again, you have a really good sense of where it's going to be at different at different altitudes. Very easy to do. Also, similar to the turbulence layer, you see the PyReps rather come into play here too. So on the screen right now, we have both icing and turbulence on. So in Pennsylvania to the west and north of Philadelphia, you see an orange icon which means medium. So an orange icon for turbulence. And to the northeast of Philadelphia, near New York, you see a green icon that, to me, frankly, looks like a goalpost. Green meaning, again, remember in FlyQ, green is good, relatively speaking. Orange is in the middle, and red is bad. So what this means is that you have light icing over New York City. Again, you don't know what altitude until you tap on it. It looks like it's at rime ice at 12,000 feet. So again, you can display icing and you can display turbulence at the same time. You can turn off the turbulence, just look at icing, whatever you like to do. Notice that the PyRep that was to the northwest of Philadelphia disappeared because that was a PyRep for turbulence. We turned turbulence off, therefore the PyRep for that went away. If you want to see all the PyReps, no matter which layer or layers you have on, you can go to your stack of papers icon and select one towards the bottom in the middle column. This is PyReps. And they simply all turn on, including, notice one in just in southern New Hampshire, actually very close to where I used to live in Massachusetts. You see a blue icon. The blue icon, you may wonder, well, what's that? What's the thing that looks like a bullhorn? Well, what that simply means is that we have a weather report. It is not categorized as either turbulence or icing. So it looks like what we see here is a pilot decided while out the ground telling you what the runway looked like as he was landing the airplane. So telling you that the base is very low, only 500 feet. Coming into this particular airport, it looks like, I think that's Manchester, New Hampshire, on runway 6. Okay, so that's neither turbulence nor icing, so you see it only when you turn on the PyRep layer like that. Now, some of the other layers that work here too also have to do with the altitude slider, including some of the older layers. So for example, I'm going to turn off icing, turn off PyReps, and just go to SIGMET AirMets. The SIGMET and AirMets, notice that the altitude slider went off. However, the timeline is still on the screen. So if you want to see what the SIG AirMets look like, you can move the timeline like this. So you can see that right now, it's about 7 o'clock or so, you have an awful lot of AirMets and SIGMETs. By the way, you can tap on them to see more detail like that. And you can see how they're going to change in the future. So clearly the AirMets and SIGMETs are either going to dissipate or they're just not that many reports moving further into the future. Again, you can tap on it, see what's there, tap either on the text or on some of the details here. If you want to see the text on the right-hand side bigger, by the way, just tap on it and you see it really, really big. Another thing that's neat with the AirMets is when you have a big mess like this with all these other different AirMets, if you tap somewhere in the middle of one of them, like I just tap over here, there's a lot of different AirMets. If the one that you care about because you're at a relatively low altitude is whatever that blue bar is on the left-hand side of the pop-up, I just tap on the blue bar and it tells you, oh, okay, great, that's icing. Notice also that on the map under it, it got rid of all the other SIGMETs and AirMets under the tap except for the one I selected, the blue one. So I'll tap a red one, and now you see red, back to blue, and so on. And by the way, if you just want to see that on the map and get rid of the AirMet SIGMET box, instead of hitting close in the upper left corner, select highlight in the upper right corner of the box, and you see just the one AirMet or SIGMET that you selected. And by the way, if you then just tap on the screen, they'll come back. All right, the other one they want to talk about is one more layer. We'll turn off the AirMets and SIGMETs and just talk about the surface analysis layer. Tap off. The surface analysis layer is really handy, and this again is tied to the timeline. This is one of the other weather products which is available only through the internet. You won't see this if you're on ADSB, but you do see how it changes over time. So if we move the timeline to a different time, you can see that the expected winds aloft, or rather the surface analysis changes. So tomorrow morning at like 8 o'clock, that's what it's going to look like. Move the timeline back to somewhere around current time, and that's what it looks like. Okay, so there's a lot of weather features that are built into this release of the product. Again, you can turn on these layers as much as you want. If you really want to see radar and IR satellite and winds aloft and METARs and cloud tops and turbulence and icing, and oh, by the way, lightning you have too. If you turn on all of these, you can get a very, very, very cluttered display, but you can play with the altitude slider, you can play with the timeline, and get a really good sense of what weather is going to be like at different time. So that's what it's like to use the weather features in FlyQ EFB 4.5. One final thing I want to talk about is that in FlyQ EFB 4.5, we've also substantially upgraded the manual to it so we talk about all the new weather features. For example, if you go to the Documents tab in FlyQ EFB itself, you'll see that you can pull up the pilot's guide. If you go to approximately page 102, you see a screen that looks a little bit like this. It shows you what all the new weather products look like. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to what you see on page 103. This tells you about all the new layers, which one of them works with the internet, which works with ADSB, what the timeline does, if anything. It doesn't do anything for certain layers, whether the layer involves the altitude slider, and so on, and various notes. So a lot of information there. On the next page, it also gives you that legend, which you can also pull up from within the product. Inside here, it gives you various detailed bits of information. For example, in Icing, although you can look at the Icing layer either through the internet product or through ADSB, they are actually noticeably different. Icing through the internet shows you the potential for having some kind of icing between basically 0 and 100%. While if you get icing from the ADSB receiver, it's not probability, it's actually severity. So whether you're going to see trace ice, light ice, moderate or severe, or even super large droplets on the screen. So there's definitely some differences between ADSB weather and internet-based weather. And if you take a look at about page 104, 105 in the guide, it gives you a lot more detail about those. This has been Steve Podrachik for Seattle Avionics. I'd like to thank you very much for watching what's new today in terms of FlyQ EFB version 4.5. Have a great day. Thank you.